Adolf Hitler once said that one day his spirit would rise from the grave and the world would see he was right.
Yeah, which is just a profoundly chilling statement. And honestly, it perfectly sets the stage for exactly what we're unpacking today.
It really does. And right up front, I want to tell you what lesson you're going to learn by the end of this video. You're going to learn exactly how history manufactures its ultimate villains.
Right, and to be super clear here, we are not exploring this source material to absolve the guilty. Not at all.
No, definitely not. We're doing this deep dive to look at the complicity of the wider world, the massive hidden systems that actually enable these monsters to exist in the first place.
Because the standard historical narrative is, well, it's kind of like a blinding spotlight on a dark stage.
Yeah, exactly. We're all basically trained to just stare at the one terrifying actor standing in the light.
But today,
Mm-hmm.
we are bringing up the house lights to see who else was standing on that stage with him.
Exactly. And to see that whole machinery, we really have to start in the mud. Let's go back to 1918, the trenches of the First World War.
Right, which a lot of people don't even realize he fought in.
Yeah, and he wasn't a general or anything. He was literally a courier boy for the German army. His whole job was running messages back and forth from headquarters to the front lines.
Right, through active artillery fire.
Exactly. And there's this incredible, profound butterfly effect moment that the source material points out here. He gets caught in a gas attack in this small village in France.
He's temporarily blinded, right?
Right. Stumbling around the battlefield completely unarmed. And out of the smoke, this British soldier named Henry Tandy, who's a highly skilled, heavily decorated guy, he aims his rifle right at his chest.
I mean, it is the ultimate historical hinge point. Tandy has him dead to rights.
But he doesn't pull the trigger.
No, he doesn't. He sees this unarmed, wounded guy struggling to see, and, his humanity just kicks in.
Wow.
He lowers his weapon, he nods, and he actually lets him live.
It's just mind-blowing to think about. It was a split-second decision based purely on mercy.
Yeah, Tandy thought he was just sparing some helpless kid. He had absolutely no idea he was sparing a man who would, eventually order the deaths of millions.
Right, so he ends up in a military hospital. And while his eyes are bandaged, he gets the news that Germany has unconditionally surrendered.
And reportedly, he just wept on his hospital bed.
But that surrender, it wasn't just a military loss. It brought the Treaty of Versailles. And this is where we really need to dig into the actual mechanics of societal collapse that the source lays out.
Yeah, because the Treaty of Versailles is basically the absolute foundation of everything that comes next.
It was framed as a peace treaty, right?
It was framed that way, but functionally it was an economic execution. The Allied powers, they didn't just want to defeat Germany. They wanted to make sure it could literally never stand up again.
Right.
So they stripped Germany of its territories, its military, its gold reserves.
Yeah.
And they imposed these massive, crushing financial reparations.
Reparations that the country had absolutely no way of paying.
Exactly.
Let's talk about what that actually looked like on the ground for regular people. Because, we throw the word hyperinflation around.
Oh, totally.
But the reality of Weimar Germany in the 1920s is almost hard to comprehend. We're talking about a scenario where the currency was devaluing by the hour.
Yeah, German citizens were taking literal wheelbarrows and suitcases full of cash just to go to the bakery.
Just for a single loaf of bread.
Right. If you sat down at a cafe, the price of your coffee might literally double before you even finish drinking it.
Which is insane. Imagine working your entire life, saving up a pension, and waking up one morning to find out your life savings can't even buy a postage stamp.
It's devastating. And it doesn't just break the economy, it psychologically breaks the middle class. When money loses its value like that, society loses its tether to reality.
People were starving.
Starving. Crime skyrocketed.
Yeah.
And naturally, the population blamed their own government, the Weimar Republic, for being weak and corrupt and bowing to foreign powers.
So you have this population that's stripped of its dignity, its wealth, its physical security. And that level of national despair, it creates a massive psychological vacuum.
It really does. People become so desperate for order, just any kind of order, that they're willing to accept extreme solutions.
And this is the perfect petri dish for an opportunist. He takes over this small, fringe workers' party, rebrands it as the Nazis, and launches his 25-point program.
Right, and he doesn't offer, nuanced policy debates. He offers absolute certainty
He promises to fix the economy.
to tear up the humiliating Treaty of Versailles and restore German pride.
But here is what I just don't understand, and the source material gets into this. You have this radical fringe guy
This
screaming
video
in
is
beer
presented for
halls.
historical and
The
educational
established
purposes
politicians
only.
in Germany, they
World
knew he was
Documentary
dangerous.
Archives
Oh,
strongly
absolutely.
condemns
Yet they
hate
are the
speech,
ones who put him in
violence,
power. I mean,
and
it
all
seems like the
forms of
very
extremism.
people trying to suppress a radical movement ended up handing it the keys to the castle. Was he some sort of political genius, or did he just capitalize on a corrupt system?
Well, according to the analysis, he was a master at exploiting the hubris of the political elite. By 1932, his party had gained a significant number of seats in the parliament.
But they didn't have a majority, right?
Exactly, no majority. The president of Germany, Paul von Hindenburg, and a former chancellor named Franz von Papen, they actually despised him. They thought he was this uncultured extremist.
Right.
But they needed his massive populist support to secure their own grip on power.
So they invite him in. They do this backroom deal in January 1933. They offer to make him chancellor, with von Papen acting as vice chancellor.
And their logic, which is just astounding in hindsight, was literally, we will make him a puppet chancellor.
A puppet.
Yeah, we will box him in with traditional conservatives and we'll control him.
Which was just a catastrophic miscalculation. And Hindenburg and von Papen basically treated him like a feral guard dog that they could just keep on a leash.
To scare off their communist rivals, yeah.
They completely forgot that if you starve a guard dog and let it into the house, eventually it eats the owner.
Right, so he accepts their deal without negotiating, because he really only needed a foot in the door. He becomes chancellor. And then we immediately see the blueprint for legally dismantling a democracy.
Yeah, just 1 month later, the Reichstag, the German parliament building, mysteriously burns down in an arson attack.
And he instantly uses the ashes of that building to build his dictatorship.
Yeah.
He blames his political opponents, creates this massive national panic about a communist uprising, and pushes through the Enabling Act.
Walk us through how that act actually worked, because it's important to remember this wasn't a military coup. It was a bureaucratic takeover.
Right, the Enabling Act was essentially a constitutional suicide pact. It allowed the chancellor to pass laws without the approval of parliament or the president.
Wow.
He used the fear of the Reichstag fire to convince the politicians to literally vote away their own power.
So within months, he outlawed opposing political parties, sidelined von Papen, and when President Hindenburg died next year, he simply combined the offices.
He declared himself the absolute, undisputed dictator. The system legally dismantled itself.
The house lights are coming up, you know. We see that the political establishment built the throne, polished it, and invited the monster to sit down.
Exactly.
But this brings up a really uncomfortable question that the source dives deeply into. If we look at the raw statistics of the 20th century, the numbers tell a very complicated story.
They really do.
We universally view him as history's singular ultimate evil. But if you look objectively at the data of other totalitarian regimes during that exact same era, you kind of have to ask why he is the default face of evil.
While others get a slightly different treatment in our history.
Right. And again, as we get into this next part, I want to remind you that we are strictly unpacking the arguments presented in our source material. We're maintaining absolute neutrality, just looking at the facts as they're laid out.
This is where the analysis requires us to step back and look at the global landscape of atrocity. If you examine the actions of Mao Zedong in China, for example, the scale of human destruction is just staggering.
The source mentions the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s.
Yes, the goal was to forcefully and rapidly shift China from an agrarian society to an industrial superpower.
But the mechanism of how they actually did it is terrifying. The government seized all private farmland, forced people into these massive agricultural communes, and set physically impossible production quotas for grain and steel.
And because the entire system was built on absolute fear, local officials were terrified of being punished for failing to meet those quotas.
How they lied?
Right, they lied. They reported massive surpluses that simply didn't exist. So the central government, believing these lies, exported the grain or took it for the cities.
Leaving the farmers with absolutely nothing.
Nothing. The result was a systemic failure that caused the largest man-made famine in human history. The source notes that between 1959 and 1961, an estimated 30 to 40 million people starved to death.
Which is just, I mean, entire villages were wiped out. People were eating tree bark, dirt, anything just to survive.
Yeah.
And then the source material brings up Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. While the camps were being built in Germany, Stalin basically turned his entire massive nation into a prison.
Right. We were talking about the Great Purge.
Yeah.
Anyone who even mildly challenged Stalin intellectuals, teachers, his own military officers, they were either executed or packed onto trains and sent to the Gulag.
And the gulags were these forced labor camps in the frozen wasteland of Siberia. We are talking about temperatures dropping to minus 40 degrees.
Millions of people were literally worked to death mining gold and cutting timber in the freezing cold.
Not to mention, Stalin orchestrated the Holodomor,
Right, the intentional engineered famine in Ukraine.
taking their grain quotas and leaving millions to starve. All told, the source attributes over 20 million deaths of his own people to Stalin. But wait, the source notes an incredible irony here. If Stalin systematically killed 20 million people and engineered famines, how on earth is it possible that he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize?
Twice. He was nominated twice.
I just can't wrap my head around that.
Well, the source explains it comes down to the mechanics of historical PR and the concept of bureaucratic rebranding.
Bureaucratic rebranding.
Yeah, dictators like Mao and Stalin masked their atrocities under the guise of progress. Mao didn't call it a mass starvation event, he called it the Great Leap Forward.
Right.
Stalin didn't call it a massacre, he framed his purges as protecting the Cultural Revolution. They used the language of development and state security.
And it wasn't just the communists doing this rebranding, according to the document. Look at Imperial Japan. Hideki Tojo oversaw Unit 731 in Manchuria.
Which was horrific.
It wasn't just a prison camp. It was a secret facility where scientists conducted literal live biological experiments on civilians and prisoners of war.
Yeah, they performed vivisections without anesthesia to observe live organs. They deliberately froze people's limbs to study frostbite treatment.
They dropped plague-infected fleas on cities.
And the bureaucratic framing after the war is, honestly, the most disturbing part that the source highlights.
What happened to those Japanese scientists? Because you'd think they'd be tried for war crimes.
You would think so, but the United States government secretly granted many of them immunity from prosecution.
Wait, immunity?
Yes. Instead of hanging them for war crimes, the U.S. hired them. The American military wanted their biological weapons data, so the atrocity was rebranded as scientific advancement by the victors.
Oh, wow. So it really begs the question, if the sheer numbers under Mao or Stalin are higher and the methods of Unit 731 are just as brutal, why does history point the spotlight so exclusively at Germany's dictator?
The source outlines two main reasons. First, Stalin and the U.S. were on the winning side of World War II. The victors write the history, and they naturally write themselves as the heroes.
Right.
Second, Hitler didn't hide behind the language of agricultural progress. He was overtly, loudly bragging about his genocidal intentions in his speeches.
He was openly obsessed with racial extermination.
Exactly. Because he was so unabashed about his evil, and because his side lost, he became the perfect centralized villain.
Because pointing the finger at the ultimate evil allowed the victorious nations to conveniently deflect attention away from their own gulags, their own engineered famines, and their own complicity in hiring war criminals.
Every good story needs a singular villain so the rest of the cast doesn't look so bad.
That makes a lot of sense. But, to understand how he actually executed those horrifying visions, the source material says we have to look at the tools he used. He didn't just hypnotize an entire nation out of thin air.
No, he weaponized pre-existing hatred and very specific economic systems.
Exactly. The narrative that one man just invented antisemitism in the 1930s completely ignores centuries of global history.
He weaponized a societal bias that had been festering across the world for a very long time.
For example, the source points to Henry Ford, the American automaker. Hitler was actually a massive fan of Ford, to the point where he kept a portrait of him behind his desk.
He even awarded him the Grand Cross of the German Eagle.
Right, and the connection wasn't about the assembly line or cars. Ford used his massive wealth to fund and distribute a profoundly anti-Semitic newspaper series called The International Jew,
which was published in the U.S., translated into German, and deeply influenced public sentiment well before the Nazis took absolute power.
It just highlights that this prejudice wasn't localized to Germany.
Not at all. If you look at the historical timeline, Jewish populations had been systematically expelled from nations like England, France, Spain, and parts of the Roman Empire for thousands of years.
Primarily driven by religious conflicts between the major Abrahamic faiths.
Right. And because they were constantly pushed out of mainstream society, banned from owning land or holding traditional jobs, they had to build survival systems in the alternative sectors that were available to them at the time.
Specifically, money lending, early banking, and later, media and entertainment.
Which is the crucial mechanism of how a scapegoat is formed. When you force a marginalized group into specific financial sectors over centuries, they become highly visible in those sectors.
So when the German economy collapsed in the 1920s and people were pushing wheelbarrows of worthless cash, he didn't have to invent a new enemy.
He took a minority group that was already facing widespread prejudice, and he pointed the finger directly at them.
He blamed them for the loss of World War I and the economic ruin. He basically turned ancient public frustration into a highly effective modern political weapon.
And that leads directly into probably the most controversial economic argument we are unpacking today from the source material, the banking system.
Yeah, this is where things get really intense. The source argues there is a deeply rooted pattern in global history regarding sovereign currency. Some analyses in the document draw a line connecting the assassinations of major historical figures.
Like Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, Muammar Gaddafi.
Now, hold on. Because linking a German dictator in the 1930s to the assassinations of JFK and Lincoln sounds like a massive leap into conspiracy territory.
Yeah.
I mean, how does the source actually justify connecting those dots without losing all credibility?
Well, the source does it by looking strictly at the economic mechanisms. It's not endorsing a wide-ranging theory, it's reporting on a specific financial pattern.
Right.
The connective tissue being argued here is that all of these leaders, at various points, attempted to bypass private international central banks to create their own sovereign currency.
Like Lincoln printing greenbacks to fund the Civil War debt-free.
Exactly. Or Kennedy signing Executive Order 11 of 10, which attempted to issue silver certificates directly from the Treasury.
And Gaddafi wanting to create a gold-backed African currency.
Right. So what did Germany do in 1933?
Well, Germany was entirely bankrupt, locked out of global trade, and owing massive reparations. So according to the document, the German government essentially created a shadow economy. They introduced something called MEFO bills.
MEFO bills, yeah.
Walk me through what a MEFO bill actually is. Because reading about it, it almost sounds like financial magic.
It kind of is. Imagine a country creating a shadow credit card that the rest of the world can't see. The government wanted to rebuild its infrastructure and secretly fund a massive military buildup, but they had absolutely no money.
So they set up a fake shell company called MEFO.
Right. When the government hired a contractor to build a road or a tank, instead of paying them in the worthless national currency, they paid them in MEFO bills.
Which are essentially government IOUs from this fake company.
Precisely. And those contractors could trade those IOUs with each other to buy steel and concrete.
So it functioned as a parallel hidden currency that circulated entirely outside the international banking system.
They bypassed taking high-interest loans from global banks. And by using this closed-loop system, German unemployment dropped from 30% down to just 2% in 5 years.
And their industrial outputs skyrocketed.
Right, so the argument the source presents is that World War II wasn't just an ideological war over territory, it was fundamentally an economic rebellion against the international banking establishment.
And history shows that leaders who successfully challenge the global financial monopoly tend to face catastrophic consequences.
It creates a fascinating lens, doesn't it? It suggests the conflict was as much about who controls the issuance of money as it was about borders.
Which brings the house lights all the way up for our final look at the stage. Because war on this scale requires a vast, highly efficient, and deeply complicit system. We have to look at the corporate complicity.
Oh, absolutely.
We aren't just talking about shadowy 1930s arms dealers here. We are talking about massive, modern, beloved brand.
BMW, Porsche, Volkswagen.
Companies we still buy cars from today. They were deeply intertwined with the Nazi war machine, relying heavily on forced labor.
But the one that really stops you in your tracks, the one the source highlights, is IBM.
Yes, IBM. Because the Holocaust was not just a horrific act of violence, it was a massive bureaucratic undertaking. To systematically identify, track, catalog, and transport millions of people across an entire continent, you need an unprecedented data management system.
And keep in mind, there were no computers back then.
So how did they do it?
Well, IBM provided the technology. They created custom Hollerith punch card machines. Every punch in a card represented specific data.
Like religion, location, profession.
Exactly. IBM's German subsidiary supplied these machines, they train the operators, and they service them.
So the terrifying mechanized efficiency of the extermination camps was literally powered by corporate data technology.
A genocide managed by spreadsheets and punch cards.
It's just chilling. And it wasn't just the corporations looking the other way for profit, it was the geopolitical superpowers too. Let's look at the appeasing politicians.
The Munich Agreement is the ultimate example of shared guilt here.
Right. England and France basically sat down with him, looked at a map, and signed a piece of paper giving him a free pass to invade and annex the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia.
They literally handed over a sovereign nation because they thought it would appease him and prevent a broader war. They compromised their supposed democratic morals because it was politically convenient.
They fed another country to the beast, hoping it would eat them last.
Exactly. And while all historical eyes are fixated on Germany as the sole aggressor, look at what the rest of the globe was doing at the exact same time.
Right, everyone was expanding. Imperial Japan was brutally invading China and Korea. Fascist Italy was invading Ethiopia to build an African empire.
The Soviet Union, who history remembers as one of the good guys of the Allied powers, they literally signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany.
They shook hands, agreed to jointly invade Poland, and split it right down the middle.
The entire world was playing a game of imperial conquest. But history only puts the spotlight on one man.
And to be absolutely clear, none of this minimizes the profound evil of that man. We are in no way defending him.
Not at all. In fact, a detail that perfectly captures the gravity of that evil is the story of his own family, which the source includes.
His own nephew.
Yes, William Patrick Hitler, who actually later moved to the U.S. and served in the Navy against Germany, he intentionally decided never to have children.
Wow.
He and his brothers made a pact to end the bloodline. They wanted to guarantee that no one from that genetic lineage would ever exist on the earth again.
When your own family willingly extinguishes their bloodline to erase your legacy, it proves the sheer magnitude of the horror.
It really does.
But it also underscores the ultimate conclusion we are driving at today with this source material. History keeps the spotlight solely on the one supreme monster as a psychological defense mechanism.
It prevents the rest of the world from having to look in the mirror.
The appeasing politicians who handed over nations, the opportunistic corporations who built the data machines, the rival empires who starved their own people.
It stops them from ever having to stand trial for their own shared guilt. War is a systemic failure. When we accept a simple comic book narrative of good versus evil, we blind ourselves to the complex, deeply compromised systems that actually govern our world.
Wow. We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We started in the muddy trenches of World War I, looking at the trauma of a spared life. We examined the psychological destruction of hyperinflation and the political arrogance that legally handed a democracy over to an extremist.
And we compared the horrifying statistics of atrocity, realizing that while the actions were uniquely evil, the mechanisms of mass death were being used by other leaders who were conveniently rebranded by history.
We explored how centuries of marginalization created a perfectly visible scapegoat, how bypassing international banking systems has historically triggered massive conflict.
And finally, we turned the lights onto the corporations and global superpowers whose complicity allowed the whole tragedy to unfold.
And this is exactly why this matters to you today. The mechanics of how history is written and how narratives are curated, they haven't changed. If you found this deep dive into history's hidden mechanics as fascinating as we did, we want to hear from you.
Definitely.
Please leave a comment down below with your thoughts. What part of this deep dive surprised you the most? Did the corporate complicity shock you, or the bureaucratic rebranding of other regimes? Let us know. And make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next deep dive into the truth behind the narratives we've been taught.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. We've seen how the global systems, the massive corporations, and the political structures that helped create history's ultimate villain were never truly held accountable. They just pointed at the spotlight.
Right.
So you have to wonder what modern narratives are being carefully curated right now to hide the collective failures of our own era.
The house lights are up. But you have to ask yourself, whose spirit is quietly waiting in the wings of the stage, hoping we only keep our eyes on the spotlight?